looking at the reading here, and I asked you to begin on page 34. Let me back up a little bit, page 33. Um, middle of page 33, he says, "We have thus at least shown that if duty is a concept which is to have significance and real legislative authority for our actions, then such duty can be expressed only in categorical imperatives, but not at all in hypothetical ones. That is, if duty is to have authority over us, that is truly be duty, it has to be expressed in a categorical imperative, not a hypothetical one." But then he says, "But we have not yet advanced far enough to prove a priori that there actually is an imperative of this kind. That is, to prove that there really is a categorical imperative. There's no need to prove hypothetical imperatives, they're all around us. It's the categorical one that's problematic because the categorical one just says you must do this or you must not do that and doesn't give you any condition. So, what would be the basis for an unconditional categorical imperative? It's really the question that he takes up here in these few pages. What could be the basis of it? I think the key is here on page 35. And this is the distinction between subjective and objective ends. Um, it says in the middle of the paragraph, "Hence there arises the distinction between subjective ends, which rest on incentives, and objective ends, which depend on motives valid for every rational being." A subjective end is something which is a goal, a purpose, something which has value. But it's subjective, that value, in the sense that its value depends upon some subject, you or me, valuing it. So a hamburger could be an end, a purpose, something that has value for me, let's say. But its value depends upon me. It depends on my desire or inclination. It depends on me valuing it. So if I don't value it, it has no authority over me. Right? This is the problem. You the question is whether anything is an end for me, anything has value for me that doesn't depend upon me valuing it for its value. If you see what I mean, that would be the basis. That is, if there was such a thing that had objective value or was an objective end, then it would not only be valuable for me because I value it. No, it would be value for me just because of what it is, and being valuable for me would be valuable for everyone else too. As he says, objective ends which depend on motives valid for every rational being. So some things have value for me, but because I value them, I desire them. So that if I didn't desire them, they wouldn't have value. But something with objective worth, an objective end, would be valuable for me just because I was a rational being that could recognize its intrinsic value. And in recognizing that it had value for me, I would also recognize that it had value for everyone else. And that would be the ground, that would be the basis for a categorical imperative, something in the world which I recognize as having intrinsic value, and that could be the basis for the categorical imperative, because the categorical imperative commands me absolutely. The categorical imperative says you must do this or you cannot do that. To provide a basis for that, there must be something in the world that has the kind of intrinsic value that could give it that sort of authority over my actions. And he does think that there's such a thing. Uh, and that's what he begins to describe in the bottom of page 35, where he says, "Now I say that man, a human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, and not merely as a means." So there's the thing. That's the answer. I think that's the basis and ground for the categorical imperative, is the existence of rational beings or persons. And this distinction between persons and things is incredibly important. That's what he says here on page 36, um, where he says in the first line, on the other hand, rational beings are called persons. And he's just contrasted that with things. But in the world, there are two types of being: things and persons. And things, I suppose, obviously, can only have subjective or relative worth, whereas it's the rational being, which we call a person, which has intrinsic or objective value, and therefore is the absolute sine qua non, the absolute without which nothing for a categorical imperative. That is, there had to be a ground foundation for the categorical imperative. There has to be something in the world that has intrinsic value. If everything in the world had merely relative or subjective value, then there would be no basis for a categorical imperative. There would only be hypothetical imperatives. But because there is something in the world, creatures like you and me, rational creatures or persons, there's the basis that makes possible a categorical imperative. And that provides a basis for articulating a new version of the categorical imperative, which comes at the end of the second paragraph. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means.